The afternoon my boss's wife asked me to move a couch, I learned something terrifying about the secrets people keep in plain sight. I'd worked for Mark for years. His wife Julia was the quiet perfectionist who refilled your glass before you realized it was empty. But that Saturday, she grabbed my wrist, whispered, "There's something else I need moved." And suddenly I wasn't just an employee with boundaries. I was an accomplice to the end of her marriage. My name is Alex. For 3 years, I managed Mark's logistics and never looked twice at his wife Julia, until the afternoon she whispered 7 words that made me an accomplice. What I didn't know was that her marriage had been dead for years, and I had just walked into its autopsy. To understand how I got there, you have to understand the architecture of my life before that Saturday. I was 31, single, and aggressively ordinary in the way that makes people stop asking about your love life after a while. I had a one-bedroom apartment with a couch that didn't need moving, a rotation of 3 podcasts I re-listened to constantly, and a job managing operations for Mark's regional distribution company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, predictable, the kind of life where nothing surprises you because you've arranged everything to prevent surprises. Mark hired me 3 years earlier after a 20-minute interview where he spent 10 of those minutes talking about his boat. He was the type of boss who remembered your birthday but also expected you to answer emails on vacation. Charismatic, loud, generous with bonuses, terrible at reading a room. We weren't friends exactly, but we had the easy rhythm of men who spend 40 hours a week solving problems together without ever learning each other's middle names. His wife Julia was the counterweight. Where Mark filled a room, Julia organized it. At company barbecues, she moved through crowds like a stage manager, refilling drinks before glasses were empty, redirecting conversations away from landmines, laughing at Mark's jokes with a precision that felt more professional than affectionate. She was beautiful in a way that didn't demand attention. Tall, dark hair always pinned back, eyes that seemed to register everything while revealing nothing. I'd spoken to her maybe a dozen times in 3 years, always about logistics, when Mark would be back from a trip, whether we needed more chairs for the holiday party, what wine she should order for the client dinner. She was efficient, polite, and entirely opaque. But here's the thing about opacity: you stop looking. And that was my first mistake. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Julia's name on my phone was strange enough to make me answer on the first ring. She apologized for bothering me, her voice lower than I remembered, almost breathless. Mark was away on a fishing trip with clients. A furniture delivery had arrived early. Could I possibly swing by Saturday morning to help her move the old leather couch into the garage before the new one came? She said it like a routine request, the kind of thing you'd ask a neighbor. I said yes without thinking. Why wouldn't I? I was the reliable operations guy, the one who solved problems. A couch was just another piece of cargo. Saturday arrived humid and gray. I pulled into their driveway and noticed Mark's SUV was gone, as expected. Julia met me at the door in jeans and a linen shirt, her hair down for once, and I registered that she looked different. Tired, maybe. Or something more specific. She looked like a woman who had been rehearsing something. The house was quiet in that particular way empty houses are, all ticking clocks and refrigerator hum. The leather couch sat in the living room like a dark animal that had decided to die there. We wrestled with it for 20 minutes, sweating, laughing a little too easily when a leg caught on the doorframe, her shoulder pressing against mine as we angled it through the hallway. There was something unexpectedly intimate about it. 2 adults reduced to grunting and shuffling, all the normal social armor stripped away by physical effort. I remember thinking briefly that this was the most human interaction I'd had in months. That should have been a warning. When we finally dropped it in the garage, I was dusting off my hands and reaching for my keys, already mentally driving home to my predictable afternoon. That's when her fingers closed around my wrist. I turned. Her eyes were wet, not crying exactly, but full, steady, like water at the rim of a glass that hasn't yet spilled. She held my gaze and whispered, "There's something else I need moved." She wasn't looking at the furniture. She was looking at the locked door at the end of the hallway, the one I'd always assumed was a home office. And in the silence that followed, I understood that this woman I'd barely known for 3 years was about to ask me to help her leave her husband, my boss, the man who signed my paychecks, the man whose boat stories I'd endured for half a decade, and that saying yes would cost me everything I'd built, while saying no might cost her everything she had left. She led me to that locked door at the end of the hallway, and I followed like a man who had already forgotten how to say no. The key was on a chain around her neck, something I hadn't noticed before, which meant she had planned this moment long before the couch ever needed moving. The door opened into a room that wasn't an office at all. It was a staging ground. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled in her handwriting: kitchen, winter clothes, books, photos. A suitcase sat open on a fold-out table containing what looked like years of financial documents, bank statements, tax returns, a deed. The curtains were drawn, and a single lamp gave the room the amber glow of a confessional. Julia closed the door behind us and leaned against it like she'd been holding up that doorframe for years and had finally stopped pretending. She told me everything, not in a rush, but in the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed the sentences so many times they'd worn grooves in her mind. Mark wasn't just a mediocre husband or an absent partner. He was a man who had built an entire identity on performance. The boat, the client dinners, the generous bonuses, all of it was a front for a business he'd been bleeding dry. He was weeks away from bankruptcy, maybe worse. He'd hidden debt, cashed out retirement funds she didn't know existed, and had recently started forging her signature on loan documents. But that wasn't even the part that broke her voice. The affair had been going on for 2 years. A younger woman in the accounting department, someone Julia had hosted at dinner parties, someone who'd complimented her cooking while sleeping with her husband. Julia found the text by accident 6 months earlier, and when she confronted Mark, he didn't apologize. He laughed. He told her she needed him, financially, socially, practically. That she'd be nothing without the house, the cars, the life he'd given her. And then he'd opened a bottle of wine and asked what she was making for dinner. I stood there in that amberlit room, my shirt still damp from moving furniture, my boss's wife telling me she needed to vanish before Mark returned from his fishing trip, and I felt the floor of my life tilt like a ship taking on water. Because helping her wasn't just a moral decision. It was a legal one. If Mark was forging documents, moving assets before a bankruptcy could constitute fraud, and if I helped remove evidence from that house, I wouldn't just lose my job. I could face charges. I could lose everything. But then she opened the folder. Inside were pictures. Not evidence, not documents, but photographs she'd taken over the years. Her mother's garden, the coastline near their honeymoon spot, a stray cat that used to sleep on their porch, her own face in a mirror, younger and less guarded. She wasn't showing me proof. She was showing me the life she'd been holding onto while the walls fell down around her. And somewhere in the middle of that folder was a single sheet of paper, a letter she'd written to herself, dated 3 years earlier, listing the reasons she should have left the first time. At the bottom of that list, in pen that had nearly torn through the page, she'd written, "I will not die in this house." That word choice, die, changed something in my chest. This wasn't just a woman leaving a bad marriage. This was a woman who had calculated the cost of staying and found it equivalent to death. I asked her what exactly she needed moved. She pointed to the boxes, the suitcase, and then to a locked metal cabinet in the corner. Inside that cabinet, she said, was the only copy of the original loan documents proving Mark's forgery. She'd taken them from his home office 2 nights earlier. She didn't want money. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to be free, but she also wanted her name cleared before Mark's house of cards collapsed and took her down with it. That was the pivot. That cabinet wasn't just about her escape. It was the only leverage she had to keep herself out of prison. And if Mark came back early and found it empty, he'd know exactly who took it and exactly who helped. I was standing at the intersection of doing nothing, which would leave a woman to face a legal and financial nightmare alone, and doing the right thing, which would make me an accessory to taking stolen documents from my employer's home. She watched me silently, her wet eyes now dry, her spine straight. She had stopped asking. The choice was entirely mine. Then my phone buzzed, a text from Mark. "Hey man, you still at the house? Julia said you were helping with the couch. Come by the marina later, we'll have a beer. "I've got a business idea I want to run by you." He didn't know. But reading that text while standing in that room, surrounded by the evidence of his destruction, made the decision feel less like a choice and more like a correction. I put the phone away and looked at Julia. "Where are we taking this stuff?" I asked. Her face broke open, not into tears, but into the raw, disbelieving relief of someone who had finally been believed. But before she could answer, I heard something that turned my blood cold. A key turning in the front door. The sound was unmistakable, metal sliding into the deadbolt, the mechanism turning, the heavy front door swinging open. Julia's hand clamped onto my arm with the force of a woman who had nothing left to lose. We stood frozen in that amber-lit room, surrounded by the evidence of 3 years of carefully planned escape, listening to footsteps cross the threshold of the house we'd assumed was empty for the whole weekend. Then a voice, not Mark's, a woman's voice, high and familiar and dripping with the casual cruelty of someone who believes she owns the space she's walking into. "Mark, the garage door is open." She probably just forgot to close it. That voice belonged to Claire, the accountant from Mark's office, the one Julia had hosted at dinner parties, the one who'd complimented her cooking. I'd met her twice at company events, blonde, 26, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been held accountable for anything. And behind her, a lower rumble, Mark's laugh, dismissive, slightly drunk. "Julia's always leaving things half-finished," he said. "She moved the couch out, at least." That's something. They were inside, together. The fishing trip had been a lie, a cover for whatever weekend they'd actually been planning, and now they'd come back early, or maybe they'd never left town at all. Julia's face had gone pale, but her eyes were dry now, sharp, calculating. She pressed a finger to her lips and pointed at the door. We needed to stay silent, but we also needed to hear what they were saying. And what they were saying changed everything. Mark poured himself a drink. I could hear the clink of ice against glass. Claire was rifling through papers, her voice drifting down the hallway like smoke. "Did you get the new signatures? Because if those documents don't match, the whole thing falls apart at the audit next month." "Relax," Mark said. "I've been practicing her signature for 2 years. The bank won't look twice. But the tax returns are already filed. Under her name, her social security number. If anything goes wrong, the paper trail leads straight to Julia. She's the one who supposedly signed for the loans. She's the one who supposedly moved the money. I'm just the husband who trusted his wife." I turned to look at Julia, and what I saw on her face wasn't shock, it was confirmation. She'd suspected this. She'd known he was framing her, but hearing it spoken aloud in his own voice, in her own home with his mistress standing in her kitchen, that was a different order of devastation. He wasn't just leaving her in debt, he was building a criminal case with her name on it, but it got worse. Claire laughed, a cold little sound. "And if she fights it, if she hires a lawyer? With what money I drained the joint accounts last month, she's got nothing. Besides, no one's going to believe her over me. I'm the successful businessman. She's the depressed housewife who couldn't handle the pressure. I've got the medical records to prove it, doctor's notes from last year when she was anxious, overwhelmed. I'll say she had a breakdown, started forging my name, lost touch with reality. By the time I'm done, she'll be lucky if she's not institutionalized." Julia's hand was shaking now, but not with fear, with rage. This was the man she'd married. This was the man she'd spent a decade serving, hosting for, covering for. And he'd been building a machine designed to destroy her completely, not just financially but psychologically, not just legally but medically. He was going to gaslight her into a courtroom and use her own mental health history as a weapon. Then Claire said something that made Julia's breath catch. "Did you get the cabinet, the one with the original documents?" Mark grunted. "It's in her little office room. She thinks I don't know about the key around her neck. I let her keep it because it made her feel safe. But I've had a spare this whole time." Footsteps. Heading toward the hallway, toward us. Julia moved faster than I thought possible. She grabbed my wrist, pulled me past the metal cabinet, and slid open a narrow closet I hadn't noticed before, a coat closet, empty except for a few cleaning supplies. She pushed me inside, then followed, pulling the folding door shut with a soft click. We were pressed together in the darkness, her heartbeat hammering against my chest, the smell of detergent and dust, and whatever perfume she'd put on that morning filling the small space. The door to the room opened. Mark's footsteps, heavy and unhurried, crossed the floor just a few feet away. Through the thin slats of the closet door, I could see his silhouette moving past the boxes, past the open suitcase, toward the metal cabinet. He had a key in his hand. He was humming. Then he stopped. Julia tensed against me. He'd noticed something, a box out of place, the lamp still on, the faint indentation of our footsteps on the carpet. I held my breath. For 10 seconds, maybe 15, the only sound in the world was Mark standing in that room, staring around at the evidence of his wife's planned departure, putting pieces together. "Julia," he called, not loudly, almost conversationally. "You still here?" She pressed her forehead against my shoulder, and I felt her lips form the words, "Don't move." Mark took 2 steps toward the closet. Then Claire's voice rang out from the kitchen, sharper now, impatient. "Mark, did you find it?" A pause. Then he turned away. "Yeah, it's here. Everything's here. She didn't take anything after all. I told you she wouldn't." The relief that flooded through me was almost nauseating. We heard him unlock the metal cabinet, rustle through papers, then relock it. "Let's go," he said. "I want to get this to the storage unit before anyone gets curious. The audit's in 10 days. After that, Julia can rot in whatever hospital bed they put her in." Footsteps retreated. The front door closed. The key turned in the lock again. And then silence, the deep, ringing silence of a house that had just become a crime scene. Julia didn't move for a full minute. When she finally pushed open the closet door, her face was wet, but her jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle flexing. She walked to the metal cabinet, pulled the key from around her neck, and opened it. The documents were still there. Mark hadn't taken them. He'd been bluffing, or he'd taken something else, or he'd assumed the cabinet was a decoy. She pulled out a folder, thick with loan documents and forged signatures, and pressed it into my hands. "Now you see," she whispered. "He's going to destroy me. Not just leave me, destroy me. And the only person in the world who knows what he's planning is standing in this room with me." I looked at that folder, then at her. The choice was no longer abstract. It was a man who had just said aloud that he intended to frame his wife for financial crimes and have her committed. If I walked away now, I was complicit in that. If I stayed, I was stepping into a war with a man who had spent years building weapons I hadn't even known existed. But there was one more thing I didn't know yet. One more revelation that was about to turn this entire situation inside out. Julia opened the folder and pointed to a single line on the top document. "That's not my signature," she said. "And it's not his forgery either. Look closer." I looked. The handwriting was similar to hers, but not identical. A slightly different slant, a different pressure on the pen. Someone else had signed these documents. Someone else was involved. "It's Claire's handwriting," Julia said quietly. "She's been signing my name for months, which means she's not just the mistress. She's the partner in the crime, and she's the one who's going to walk away clean unless we prove otherwise." The full picture assembled itself like a photograph developing in acid. Mark wasn't just a cheating husband heading for bankruptcy. He and Claire were running a coordinated fraud, using Julia as the fall guy, and they'd timed it perfectly. 10 days from now, an audit would trigger. Investigators would find forged loan documents, drained accounts, filed tax returns with Julia's name all over them. Mark would play the devastated husband. Claire would be the loyal employee who testified that Julia had been acting erratically for years. And Julia would be destroyed in every way a person could be destroyed. Unless we got those documents out of that house. Unless we got her somewhere safe. Unless I used every operational skill I'd spent 3 years developing for Mark to dismantle the very machine I'd helped him build. I closed the folder and looked at Julia. "We need to leave. Right now. Before they realize what you actually have." But as we moved toward the door, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Mark. "Almost forgot. I need you to come into the office Monday morning to sign some HR paperwork. Routine stuff. Don't worry about Julia, I'll make sure she's taken care of." He knew. He absolutely knew. And that text wasn't a request. It was a threat. I stared at that text until the screen dimmed, the words, "I'll make sure she's taken care of," burning into my mind like a brand. Mark had just handed me his entire playbook in a single message. He thought he was warning me, but what he'd actually done was confirm his intentions in writing, which meant that as soon as we got out of this house, we had evidence. Julia was already moving. She swept the loose documents from the metal cabinet into a duffel bag, grabbed the financial records from the open suitcase, and handed me the folder with Claire's forged signatures. Her movements were mechanical, precise. 3 years of planning finally engaged. She pointed to the window in the corner. "We can't use the front door. There's a side gate, then a neighbor's hedge. If we stay low, we reach my car in 90 seconds. Her car. A 10-year-old Honda she'd bought in her mother's name, parked on the next street over, unknown to Mark. She prepared for this moment the way a soldier prepares for extraction. We climbed through the window into a narrow side yard, duffel bags thumping against our backs, and crouched beneath the kitchen window where a light still glowed. Through the glass I could hear Claire laughing about something, the sound ugly now that I knew what she was laughing over. We made it to the hedge, through the neighbor's yard, and into the Honda without headlights. Julia drove. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just drove until the neighborhood became highway, then pulled into a motel parking lot 40 miles north, where she finally killed the engine and let her forehead rest against the steering wheel for exactly 30 seconds before she looked at me and said, "We have 9 days. What's the plan?" The plan was built on the skeleton of Mark's own operation. I'd spent 3 years running logistics for his company, shipments, schedules, the quiet machinery of a business that turns time into money. Now I ran a different kind of operation. We spent the first night in that motel room with the documents spread across the bed like a criminal puzzle. Julia knew more than she'd told me earlier. She'd been secretly recording conversations for months, voice memos on her phone, capturing Mark's threats, his admissions, his casual cruelty. One recording, dated 6 weeks earlier, was Mark explaining to Claire exactly how he planned to disappear Julia's identity into a psychiatric diagnosis. Another was a phone call with their accountant, discussing the forged loan applications as if they were ordering office supplies. I listened to all of it, and by dawn I understood that this wasn't just a divorce gone wrong. This was a conspiracy. Monday morning, I didn't show up at the office. Instead, I was in a conference room with a forensic accountant Julia had hired through a domestic violence advocacy group, the kind of lawyer who specialized in financial abuse cases. The accountant's name was Priya, a woman in her 50s with the calm intensity of someone who had seen this exact pattern 100 times. She laid out our strategy. We needed to trigger a different kind of audit, one that started with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, not the routine review Mark was expecting. If we could get the feds to open a case before Mark's internal audit kicked in, the whole thing would flip. His paper trail would become his prison. The trick was timing. If we moved too early, Mark would destroy evidence. If we moved too late, Julia would already be named in the original audit. We had 9 days to build a case so airtight that the IRS couldn't ignore it. Julia worked 18 hours a day. She didn't break. She didn't waver. The woman who had once refilled wine glasses at company parties now walked into federal buildings with a binder full of evidence and a voice that didn't shake. She testified, off the record at first, then on, about the years of control, the isolation, the signatures she'd never signed but that appeared on documents dating back 14 months. Priya brought in a handwriting expert who confirmed that Claire's writing was on 6 different loan applications, not Julia's. The recordings were authenticated. The bank statements were cross-referenced. And slowly, with the grim inevitability of a dam cracking, the whole structure Mark had built began to collapse inward. But the final surprise came on day 7, something I hadn't anticipated, and that changed the entire calculus of who I'd been working for. The forensic accountant discovered a second set of documents, buried deeper than the first. These weren't just forgeries. They were transfers of company funds into an offshore account, dated 2 years before I was hired. The account wasn't in Mark's name. It was in mine. Mark had been using my identity as a silent partner in his fraud for years. He'd built me into the operation without my knowledge, a ghost co-conspirator who'd be left holding the bag if anything ever unraveled. That's why he'd been so friendly. That's why he'd remembered my birthday. I wasn't a trusted employee. I was a backup patsy. Priya put the document in front of me and I stared at my own name, my social security number, my address, my signature forged so carefully I almost believed it myself. and I realized that staying quiet would have destroyed me just as thoroughly as it would have destroyed Julia. I hadn't just saved her. She had saved me too. Armed with this new evidence, we gave it all to the federal investigators. On the ninth day, instead of Julia being served with audit papers, Mark and Claire were arrested at the company headquarters. The FBI raided the office I used to manage, the filing cabinets I used to organize. Julia watched from a coffee shop across the street, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression unreadable as the man who tried to erase her was walked out in handcuffs. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No dramatic courtroom scene, at least not yet, though the trial is scheduled for next spring. Julia's name was cleared. The debts were traced back to Mark and Claire, and my identity theft case became a separate charge that added years to Mark's potential sentence. I lost my job, technically, but Priya hired me as a consultant for her practice, helping other victims of financial abuse identify the warning signs I'd missed. Julia and I still talk. Not romantically, that was never the point, and it's not that kind of story, but as two people who walked through the same fire and came out with their names intact. She opened a small bookstore. She planted a garden. She gave herself permission to stop performing. And when I asked her once, months later, what she would have done if I'd said no that afternoon, she smiled. The first real smile I'd ever seen from her, and said, "The plan never depended on you, but the plan worked because of you." That sentence, more than any legal document, is the one I carry closest to the bone. I think about that afternoon often, not the couch, not the whispered sentence, but the moment I realized the life I thought was safe had been weaponized against me. Mark had built a machine designed to destroy two people, and he'd hidden it inside barbecues and birthday cards and the quiet machinery of a normal job. The most dangerous